I'm Matt O'Neill, former U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of cyber operations. In this series, I sit down with people on the front lines of the cyber fight, from government to industry, to understand how they're staying one step ahead of the criminals in a world that's moving faster every day. Because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Today I'm talking with Nick Palmer, head of global business for Group IB. Group IB has built one of the most respected threat intelligence and investigation teams in the world, working with governments, law enforcement, and private industry to track digital crime at scale. They're not just responding to incidents, they're mapping entire ecosystems of threat actors, financial fraud networks, and emerging scams across continents. Nick joins me to talk about what that looks like in practice, how AI, data, and human intelligence are coming together to make cyber defense faster, smarter, and more proactive than ever. Nick, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great to see you, Matt.
So my first question is, what's your journey to combating cybercrime? Everybody's got a different sort of thing, but what brought you into this world? And obviously you've been very impactful, but it's always like that origin story that I'm always fascinated with.
Yeah, so for me personally, I would say I fell into the fight against cybercrime, and I really fell into it with, the great opportunity to work at Group IB. I'd been with Group IB for 10 years, and before that, I was living in Canada and working for a telecommunications company in broadband, internet security, product management, things like that. So nothing specific and nothing related to actually fighting against cybercrime. And when I joined Group IB, I was fascinated first and foremost by their mission statement, and that is to fight against cybercrime. Now, at the time, I didn't really know what that meant, right? All I knew from them is that, they investigated how attacks happened, first and foremost, remediated threat actors from their networks using a digital forensics and incident response team, and then actually investigated the threat actors to try and find out their true identities. And for me, ultimately, from a cybersecurity perspective, this really helps to understand who are the adversaries, what tools and techniques do they use, but most importantly, it's the ultimate deterrent to the youngsters from jumping into this cybercrime lifestyle as tools become more readily available for cybercriminals on the dark web, or potential cybercriminals on the dark web, for example. So I really just fell into it serendipitously, and I'm glad I did, because it's a true mission and one that infects people in the right ways.
Yeah, no doubt. And then when I was with the Secret Service, we would interface with Group IB from time to time, and they were always tremendous to deal with and had really good intelligence that led to a lot of real positive outcomes. So can you kind of walk through listeners what Group IB does if they're not familiar with the organization?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned that we do digital forensics and incident response. That's kind of the foundation of Group IB. But that foundation of understanding who the adversary is has gone well beyond just digital forensics and incident response. And we started to realize, hey, we know a lot about the adversaries, the tools and techniques they use, maybe information that they've already compromised. So we launched a threat intelligence service where companies can learn about the information that adversaries are going to target them with or have already targeted them with. And as we collected more, let's say, initial points of compromise, like user credentials that have been compromised from infected computers, or credit cards that have been compromised from JavaScript sniffers, or other initial points of compromise, we realized, hey, we know a lot about fraud and then how that happens at the initial stage. So we started to develop this cyber fraud fusion approach where we integrate those signals and we start to monitor the user session in order to understand initial fraud attempts, whether that be social engineering or account takeover, anything like that we can help out with. And I think the cool thing with Group IB is we also have a human and technology approach to what it is that we do. So, the guys on the intelligence side, when they see something new and upcoming from a fraud perspective, they'll share that with the fraud team. We'll test that tool and technique to see if it's actually able to defend our defensive protocols. And if so, the R&D guys within the company are constantly evolving what we do, staying in lockstep with the ever-changing threat landscapes.
So one of the things that I was most excited about having you on is I view Group IB as like the 27 Yankees or the 93 Canadians for my like the best of the best. And so you guys are in the fight every single day, And although we always talk about how we lose a lot because bad guys are making a lot of money, you guys are making a difference throughout many organizations around the world. And in your 10 years, talk to me about how you've seen the evolution of cybercrime. Are there more cyber criminals? Are they using new technology? So tell me from your perspective, Nick Palmer 10 years ago to today, how do you see the world differently?
Yeah, so I look at it from an adversarial perspective. When I first came into Group IB, it was all about targeted attacks on financial institutions or not necessarily critical infrastructure, but financially motivated threat actors, different nation state APT groups, etc. Targeting attacks against Swift and different aspects of ATM terminals. So the days of Cobalt and Money Taker and Silence and all those famous threat actors, or famous now threat actors, that conducted these targeted attacks against financial institutions. We had a killer track record of analyzing these attacks in real time and really understanding these adversaries to a great depth. And financially motivated threat actors, by nature, they want to scale their business, right? So then we saw really the evolution of different ransomware attacks and ransomware as a service, for example. And the primary reason for this is it's scalable, right? So threat actors have developed the tools and the techniques for other affiliates or people that want to work with these ransomware as a service groups to come in and say, hey, we've gained initial access to these corporate networks. Go run our playbook and compromise them, disrupt their business, and try to extort them for money. It's quick, it's scalable, and it's profitable, right? So we saw a lot of these, let's say, former threat actors that join these groups that conduct these activities or develop their own tools. So a little bit less on, I would say, the targeted attack perspective against financial institutions from that perspective. I think the other notable change is the crime as a service has really evolved. If you think from a cyber fraud perspective, before, back in the day, to spin up phishing web pages to target banking credentials for US financial institutions was a little bit more difficult than it is today, right? Like even myself with fundamental, technical skills can go to dark web, buy phishing kits, start compromising credentials for different bank accounts, for a couple $100. I have Telegram as a C2. I collect the credentials. Next step is, I want to monetize these things. I can sell them on dark web forums very easily. I can buy different browser modification tools to use the cookies to log into bank accounts, to steal money, use cryptocurrency. So, that crime as a service model with different tools available to, I would say, lower skilled people has really evolved. I would think the other element that has really evolved is the recruitment of young people from different gaming platforms that are exceptionally good at modifying games. That's a fine line between I'm going to mod this game and sell this modded game to my friends or whoever, to hey, I met this guy on Roblox or what have you. He asked me if I could do X, Y, and Z, and you're following into the wrong scheme of things. And then you look at how AI has also been implemented for businesses, but also for adversaries. We got access to a ransomware as a service panel just the other day, and it looks like the latest version of ChatGPT has just been launched on their interface, right? Where you can modify code on the go and do other forms of modification using different AI as well. So those are some of the trends that I've seen over the years.
It sounds somewhat terrifying when you think about how organized and business-like these criminal ecosystems have become over the years. And you guys were part of the GXC team takedown reported a couple weeks back. Did you find that is just a sort of like a microcosm of a larger sort of way that cyber criminals are operating these days?
I think it's right now all about scale, right?
Yeah.
For these organized crime groups. You look at the takedown by, I think it was the FBI a couple of days ago, where they confiscated $12 billion and, $100 and so million property out of London from the from the romance kingpin, right? These are organized criminal groups operating on multiple different countries with scalable recruitment models, tools, money laundering systems, organizational structure, internal tools for their business operations. They're businesses, right?
Yeah.
And where there's money, there's scale.
When I saw the takedown just the other day and the large asset forfeiture, the asset forfeiture nerd in me thought initially the level of work that they're going to have to do to identify every interested party and then all the petitioners, they're going to need a team and it's going to be for years. I'm thrilled to see that it happened, but just having run an asset forfeiture team, you're like, oh man, somebody's going to be tied up in paperwork for, which is great because it's, you disgorge the bad actors of the ill-gotten gains, but like the business of seizures, a lot of people don't see behind the curtain, and it's pretty massive. So
Yeah,
if you
I don't
were,
have that pleasure, unfortunately,
oh my gosh,
or fortunately.
we seized when I was with the service about $1.5 billion of pandemic related funds, and it took us about 2.5 years to dig out from it. But
Jeez.
again, this is what you get paid to do. This is what we do. But it's just like you don't realize the level of effort that's going to be needed until you're right in it and you're up to your eyeballs. It's a whoever's working it, it's going to be the sort of the investigation of a lifetime. So kudos to them and really happy to see it.
Absolutely.
You guys obviously being a global organization and you have visibility into cybercrime trends around the world. Have you seen any regional differences in how scams evolve, or is cybercrime becoming a fully, truly borderless enterprise?
I would say, 10 years ago versus now, the speed at which different tactics, tools, or techniques that are first seen in one region and then migrated to another region has increased exponentially, right? We did a report, I think, a year ago now. It was called Gold Digger malware. And this was the first malware that we researched that was encouraging a victim to go through the KYC process. So, holding up a driver's license, going through, moving their head around, all this kind of stuff. And the malware that would then implement different AI capabilities to perform deepfake potential. Geez, let me go back here. And then the malware would essentially perform different deepfake activity to bypass different KYC checks at insurance companies. And we first saw that in Indonesia. And I think it was just a matter of months before we started to see that in other regions. So I think, relying on technology is great, but also having boots on the ground. So we have, I think I mentioned, our digital crime resistance centers in multiple different territories all around the world. And these guys are researching the different forums, the different activities, what is being sold on underground, etc. And I think that speed at which, hey, we saw this here and we saw this, in the USA is incredible as compared to 10 years ago.
And do you find the most innovative approaches are coming from overseas into the United States for a mostly US listener group? So
Yeah, I
it's
think
important to see what's going on around the world because it's eventually going to come to your shores.
it's hugely important, right? I think
Yep.
if you look at how cyber criminals operate, right, the US is the paramount. That's the big ticket, right?
Yeah.
So when they develop a new tool or technique, they're not going to go haywire on the US right away. They're going to test in a small market, like any real business would test in Canada before they launch in the US, or Australia before they launch in the US. So cyber criminals are going to do the same thing. They're going to develop new tools, new techniques, and they're going to test those in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Australia maybe. After they've perfected their method, they're comfortable with how it works, it's going to come to the US for the big dollars, right? So monitoring outside of, hey, is it hitting me now in the US is essential to know what's going to be coming on the forefront.
So if you were briefing the CEO of a financial institution in the US or around the world for that matter, what would you tell them is the biggest blind spot in their current cyber defense posture that you guys see repeatedly?
I would say having a bridge between both cyber and fraud. And what do I mean by this, right? I think, cyber intelligence teams do a great job to understand, who are the adversaries that are going to target my business and what information is out there that has already been compromised. But let's look at how a fraud actually occurs, right? So, a fraudster is going to run information stealers or phishing activities to compromise user credentials. That's kind of step number one, right? All that's going to happen on traditionally the cybersecurity lens of the business. And this information can be used very effectively by the fraud team to not only see how these user credentials are being used for account takeover to steal money from my customers, but to actually proactively prevent against it as as well. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen many US businesses start to do is blend cyber and fraud together in cyber fusion. We do that at Group IB just historically because that's how cyber criminals operate. The other thing I would say is looking at social engineering and account takeover from that respect. How can we better understand how our customers are being called by someone and encouraged to send money somewhere where they shouldn't? How can we detect that? How can we prevent against it? And then looking at, what I mentioned about Gold Digger, some of the upcoming threats from regions that will target the US very shortly, or tools and techniques that have been used in other places and will target the US shortly.
So as you talking about some of the challenges, it sounds to me some of it's, especially in social engineering scams, authorized push payment fraud. And so obviously, it's multi-billion-dollar losses globally. The big takedown and asset forfeiture was related to authorized push payment fraud through pig butchering, romance scams, stuff like that. What are you seeing that financial institutions could do today to help their consumers? Or do you think that we're looking in the wrong area? Should we be looking, if we're really going to try to disrupt and dismantle these groups, from your perspective, we always talk about defense in depth, things like that, but where would you start?
Obviously there's defensive elements that you can put in place to monitor your own network, right? There's great solutions out there that blend cyber and fraud together and can prevent against a lot of these things currently today. I would think the gold standard, and I think it was the Aspen Institute maybe that released a report recently about how organizations need to start sharing information together and in real time, because in order to fight against fraud, you need to do it together, because the threat actors aren't just targeting one financial institution, they're targeting everybody. And not only the financials, but the retails and social media companies. It all works together, right? And unless the private industry isn't working together, it's never going to be solved in real time with just defending my own network. So, I would encourage organizations in the US to think, if I could share a bank account, a name, a credit card, a piece of information that I know is potentially fraudulent, but isn't yet an SAR that I reported or what have you. And if another organization could query that when they're, for example, opening up a new bank account, would this be able to stop fraud? We're doing this already in other countries where we have multiple financial institutions sharing information at scale, 25 plus financial institutions, payment processors, sharing information about accounts in real time in a completely anonymized format. So this is where, organizations need to get to if they want to actually disrupt fraud at scale.
So you're talking about using privacy preserving technology so you don't have some of the concerns that some folks might have, but at the same time in the US, if it's fraud, you're enabled to share that information under the B of the USA Patriot Act. So that would be more private to private, scalable sort of information sharing. And what you guys is doing is amazing. I was lucky enough to get a briefing on your platform, and it is bleeding edge and making a real difference around the world. But when we talk about private intelligence firms or private sector and public law enforcement, what does an ideal partnership look like between companies like Group IB and agencies like the Bureau, Secret Service, Europol, Interpol? Where do you see successes?
Yeah, so we've had private and some public MOUs with multiple law enforcement agencies, in Singapore, in Europe with our Europol EC3. They've been a tremendous partner with the Dutch High-Tech Crime Unit, with Ameripol in Latin America. Typically, we have these information sharing agreements primarily because we're constantly identifying threat actors from different operating groups, and we want to be able to provide that information to them. Now, sometimes it's a bilateral sharing agreement, sometimes it's not. They may say, hey, what do you make of this IP address? Or what do you know about this malware hash or this and that, right? And that can kind of give us a hint of they're looking at this, and we have some information that could be incredibly useful. So that's one area that we collaborate with LE, is how can we leverage the information that we have to actually disrupt some of this organized crime. I think like a gold standard in the future would be, and I've talked to you about this in the past, is sometimes the different law enforcement agencies and different offices don't want to query each other about what they're working on, right? So how could we leverage that data anonymization process that I mentioned previously about, the law enforcement as well get engaged by anonymously querying a bank account, a name, etc., that they're working on and get the results immediately rather than trying to work through the normal phone call channels, what have you, to spend weeks and weeks to get an answer. I think this would be the gold standard.
It's a very valid point because a lot of times we'll point fingers at private industry, financial institutions. Hey, you need to share more. And everybody talks about information sharing, but law enforcement does not do a good job of information sharing for fear of somebody taking over their case or for fear of whatever legacy institutional grist that there is. And some of it is challenges with cross borders and things like that. I mean, but where you develop, again, everything's relationship based. You develop relationships with friends and cops around the world, and all of a sudden you start to see big things happen. And there's probably very few cases of global significance that didn't have that interpersonal relationships between both public sector law enforcement folks and then also in private sector. We hear a lot.
100%.
We hear a lot about this is the era of scams, and you see it in dollar losses around the world. Do you fear that as we start to turn our attention to scams, that still enables the other sophisticated fraudsters who are doing ransomware groups or ransomware and doing all of the other stuff to sort of still fly under the radar? Am I reading that wrong? Where do you think that, I guess the question is, do you think that we are in the scam era?
I think certainly ransomware has profited, as you saw from the recent takedown, multiple billions of dollars and scaling year over year. Scams as well, right? I think I mentioned earlier on in our conversation about the crime as a service tools that exist on different dark web forms. It's becoming easier and more accessible for less skilled individuals to, hey, I have a little bit of technical skills. I'm out of work. I can buy this phishing kit. I can collect the credentials. I can log into Wells Fargo or what have you and steal money, right? So this also has been a tremendously growing industry for organized cybercriminal groups and not so organized criminal groups as well to profit. And I think as these tools become more readily available for cyber criminals, we too in the private industry need to move equally as fast to develop solutions. And part of that is going back to working together, right? How do you shut off scams? The way to shut off scams is to shut off the flow of the money, ultimately, right? So if you can know in real time or near real time the mule accounts that are being created across the US financial sector by anonymously querying and sharing this data before it reaches the official SAR process, etc. This is the way to disrupt this. I think it was $1 trillion on target trending industry by 2028 or something like this. So this is the way we have to stop it.
With the huge proliferation of scam farms, whether they're in Southeast Asia or around the world, primarily focused on crypto investment scams, pig butchering, romance scams, and things like that, and all the related adjacent things. As we start to make more collective progress, I suspect that their businesses, they're just going to find new areas to attack. Do you agree with that? And where would you think that the next area, or are they already branching out and targeting other areas of opportunity to make money?
You mean if a actor goes away from romance scams, etc., if the operations in Cambodia, Vietnam, etc., get shut down?
Yeah, meaning like if we do a better job of protecting consumers from sending money and their profits start to go down, I suspect being
They'll
criminal groups, they're going to do something else. They're not going to just close up shop. Any idea what you think that might be? Or I guess a better way to put it is, 5 years ago, if we're sitting and talking about the biggest losses, you'll talk about business email compromise, you'll talk about ransomware, we'll talk about like some of the things that we're still seeing today, not crypto investment scams. Obviously, the huge sort of adoption of cryptocurrencies enabled people to be more comfortable with cryptocurrency, which then enables more potential fraud losses. But I guess I'm asking, if you had a crystal ball and you looked 5 years from now and we're chatting, what do you think we're talking about?
I wish I had a crystal ball, man, to be honest.
Yeah.
But like you said, cyber criminals are going to find a way to make money one way or the other, right? If it's ransomware, if it's fraud, if it's what have you, we as private industry need to move fast. Now, if I had to guess like where the landscape is and what I think is going to be interesting in the near future is agentic fraud purchases. This to me is really, I think, going to be an interesting space for a lot of businesses to figure out, and figure out incredibly quickly. So let's look at like the scale of credit card compromise around the world. Just that we see to the tune of 300 million yearly kind of thing, right? So
Still, wow.
if I could use those for card not present purchases across e-commerce websites using agentic AI, that's some scalable business, right? So I think in the very near future, businesses are going to have to figure out really quickly, how do I know my agent, right?
Right.
Like, is this agent making a purchase with a compromised credit card the person that belongs to this agent that's authorizing that activity or not? This to me, I think, will be a really interesting space, and I think more quickly than we think.
Wow. So you mentioned e-commerce. What do you see as some of the pitfalls that current e-commerce retailers currently have that Group IB can come in and help them with? Is there like a typical thing that you see time and time again, and then you can deploy one of your tools to help them mitigate losses?
I think a lot of retailers do great work to, keep the chargeback rates at a relatively low percentage, hopefully somewhere south of 3%. One area that I see a lot of US retailers start to implement is this cyber fraud fusion approach. So, really trying to link together how is phishing, credential compromise, account takeover, malicious purchase, chargeback, how is that all connected? Certainly, we at Group IB have cyber threat intelligence, digital channel anti-fraud, digital risk protection, so we link that together natively. I think maybe starting to better look at how do we categorize these organized criminal groups that are actually targeting some of the major US retailers. So not only how do I reduce my chargebacks, but at what scale is someone purchasing a large amount of TVs using compromised credit cards, transferring to mules in the US using a mule address or what have you? How can they better track that adversarial activity across their e-commerce platform? That could be really one. We have another pretty cool methodology to use our compromised credit card collection to query that against transactions in real time using that data anonymization capability that I mentioned too. This can be a really quick and easy way to reduce the chargeback percentage within retailers. But yeah, I think overall they're always faced with evolution of fraud in the retail sector, and I think there's always room for improvement, and we'd be happy to help any way we can.
Sure. Looking back over your last 10 years, is there any one case that stood out for you that was either the most fun, the most novel, something where if I said, hey, Nick, start with your top three list of cases, what would be on the one?
So it was one of my first ever cases, and I think that was memorable for me. So it was basically a case. This organization came to us. They had an issue where someone was taking advantage of a loyalty program they had within a hosting service. So, if you come in and if you get a referral, someone signs up to this hosting service, this guy who made the referral would get money. And this guy over here, he was running a CSAM material website and using the credit cards from this on this hosting provider to actually launder the money, right? So this hosting company came to us and they said, we've had a few BAM infractions from the merchants, and we need to find out what's happening because we're going to lose our license to process credit cards, right? Business over. And so they tapped us and they said, can you go and find out who this is, how it's happening, and if we could potentially disrupt it? And that was my first ever investigation case that led us down a very, very interesting road to the gentleman's apartment, and that information was eventually provided to law enforcement. But for me, that was the first connection between how is this online world connected to this dude in this apartment, on shared Wi-Fi in this weird location I've never heard of, and how can law enforcement actually get that and go say hello to actually disrupt something from happening? So that was the first time that it really clicked to me full circle. A company has a problem, and at the other end, there's actually a bad guy that, people like yourself and your law enforcement colleagues can disrupt, right? And stop that from happening. That
So
was a really memorable case.
yeah, and it's interesting to me that it was your first case
Yeah.
because for me, everybody who has spent their lives in this sort of sector has a case like that I think gets that blood in your mouth, that like that addiction of the chase. And it's not
Yeah.
so much, at least from my perspective, it's not so much the aftermath, it is the chase. You have somebody somewhere in the world that is hiding, or maybe not hiding so much because they think that they can't get caught, and your job is to find them and to arrest them. And once you've identified that individual or that group, and you know that their days are numbered for, or, whether it's through law enforcement action or whatnot. To me, most of the people that I talk to always point to, man, I got a taste of that, and that set my whole career on a different angle because I fell in love with that chase, which is really cool. I used to tell people like there's three kinds of people that are in this space: people that like working cybercrime, people that love working cybercrime, and people that live working cybercrime. And when I was running my little unit in the Secret Service, I only wanted the people that lived it, because when you live it like that, it's not a hobby. Like, this is what we do, and I would do it for free because it was an addiction.
In a lot of cases, we do.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
Do you
and
feel the same way? Yeah,
I feel absolutely the same way. Like you said, I'm lucky that that was my first case because, we started the business from nothing, right? It was
yeah.
just me kind of knocking on the doors of, these Fortune 100s and trying to make some deals. But, for me to get infected by that mission early on really kept me in this space for so long and, kept that passion alive. And most importantly, implemented that understanding of cyber fraud investigation, law enforcement, and that full circle. So yeah, it's stayed with me to this day for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. So to kind of wrap up, thinking about what you're optimistic about. We see fraud losses at an all-time high, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. It seems to be getting worse, and it could just be lagging indicators and things like that. But is there something that you're particularly optimistic about over the next 3 or 4 years in fighting financial crime?
Yeah, I think this information sharing and listen, like when I first joined, some of the law enforcement sessions 9 years ago, and I'm like, oh my God, these guys are amazing. Everyone was talking about we need to share more information. We need to share more. You know the story. Everyone
Yeah.
knows that story. But this is actually what excites me is because of the technological advancements that are here now that eliminate that age-old concern of sharing private data, or it's not yet time to share that data because of X, Y, and Z. If you can have a completely anonymized query and work together to fight against crime, this is next level stuff to really scale our operations as defenders to disrupt these guys. And I'm excited about that.
It's really our best hope. I mean, it's really, we know the recipe. We just have to get in the kitchen and actually put it together. And
Absolutely.
are there any parts of the world where you're finding that it's being more rapidly adopted, whereas like, maybe countries that are lagging behind could look to them as sort of like as a use case or a model to follow?
I think privately speaking, we've done a few in Central Asia and the Middle East. I think is doing a good job as well at starting to implement a lot of these information sharing capabilities in order to disrupt fraud. If you look to Australia as well, I think they've done a fantastic job between telco, law enforcement, financial institutions to have a really organized, close-knit group of sharing information to fight against crime. I think those are some of the leading edge countries that are working on that. I'd love to see at scale some of this done in the US as well. I think it's a huge opportunity to make a big dent in some financial crime actors.
No, I completely agree. And it does seem as if now they're at least having more conversations than at least 2 years ago. But 2 years ago,
Oh, for
it
sure.
was a non-starter, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Primarily, some of them were red herrings, some of them were business decisions. But at least now, people are starting to realize there's not a business advantage of your competitor getting crushed with fraud. So that I agree with you. That's and the modeling coming out of Australia and other places is really something that we need to keep an eye on. Here in the U.S., we're going to have to come up with a uniquely U.S. solution because 16,000 financial institutions, different regulatory challenges, but the model works. and we know it works. So it's just getting people to sort of rally around it, I think, and we're getting there. So
Heck yeah. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
hopefully soon. Yes. Well, Nick, thank you so much. That was Nick Palmer from Group IB, reminding us that cybercrime isn't just code and servers, it's confidence, psychology, and timing. Every scam depends on someone clicking, trusting, or hesitating for half a second too long. What Group IB and their law enforcement partners are proving is that intelligence, collaboration, and persistence can dismantle even the most advanced digital threats. In a world where AI can clone a voice, fake a bank, or spin up a phishing kit in minutes, trust becomes the real battleground. This is Detonation Point, presented by Elastio, where we break down the moments when technology, crime, and consequence collide. If you found today's episode valuable, share it, because the more we understand how these systems work, the harder it becomes for them to win.